should have walked away, but the lion cub lay down beside the one who wasn't getting back up. The camera kept rolling as the crew froze, unsure whether to look or turn away. No struggle, no sound. Just a small body pressed close, as if holding something from slipping out of the world. And then he reached for something in the grass. The engine had already been turned halfway when Daniel lifted his hand without looking away from the horizon. "Hold on." No one asked why. After 12 days in the field, they had learned to trust the quiet pauses more than the loud ones. The savanna stretched out in a flat, sunburned hush, the kind that made everything feel already finished before it began. The crew had packed their gear with the dull efficiency of people who had come here expecting something and were leaving with nothing they could use. Daniel kept the camera pressed to his shoulder, though the red recording light had been blinking unnoticed for several minutes. At first, it wasn't even movement that caught his eye. It was absence, a space where something should have been. The rest of the pride had already crossed the low ridge in the distance, just shadows now, slipping into taller grass, their shapes dissolving into heat and distance. But one figure remained behind, small enough that it barely broke the line of the land. "Zoom in," someone whispered, though Daniel had already begun. The lens tightened slowly, pulling the distant shape closer, drawing it out of the wavering air. A lion cub, young, thin in that uneven way that came before strength settled into the bones. It wasn't running, it wasn't even moving with purpose. It had stopped. Daniel adjusted the focus, the edges sharpening just enough to reveal something else ahead of it. Something lower still, pressed into the earth in a way that didn't match the wind or the grass. The cub took a few steps forward, hesitant but not afraid. Then it lowered its head slightly, as if confirming something already known. "Is that another one?" the youngest crew member asked, his voice barely carrying over the soft hum of the idling engine. No one answered. They didn't need to. The second shape lay at an angle that told its own story, not resting, not alert, just there. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, though he couldn't have said why. He had seen death before, too many times for it to surprise him anymore. But this didn't feel like something ending. It felt like something being approached. The cub reached the other one and stopped again. For a moment, it simply stood there. The wind shifted slightly, brushing the tall grass into a soft ripple that passed around both bodies without touching them. The air held a strange kind of stillness, like a room where something important had already been decided. "Should we?" someone began, but the sentence faded before it found shape. Daniel didn't lower the camera. He watched as the cub circled once, not wide, not cautious, just enough to see from another angle. Then it stepped closer, closing the small distance that remained between them. The second lion didn't move, no twitch, no reaction to the approach. The cub leaned in, lowering its head near the other's shoulder, pausing there as if listening for something too faint to hear from afar. Daniel adjusted the focus again, slower this time, careful not to lose the moment in the mechanics of the lens. He could feel the rest of the crew watching now, not through their monitors, but directly, eyes fixed on the same quiet scene unfolding without explanation. "This isn't right," the young one said under his breath. Daniel almost responded, almost, but the words didn't come, because there was nothing wrong with what they were seeing, only something they didn't understand. The cub straightened slightly, then took a small step back. For a brief second, it looked toward the ridge where the rest of the pride had disappeared, the direction of safety, of instinct, of everything that should have pulled it away. It stayed there just long enough to make the choice visible. Then it turned back. No urgency, no confusion. Just a simple, deliberate shift of attention. Daniel felt his grip tighten on the camera. He had spent years chasing movement, chases, hunts, collisions of survival that could be cut into sequences and sold as truth. But this didn't move like anything he could package. The cub lowered itself slowly, folding its legs beneath its body, settling into the grass beside the other lion. Not touching at first, just close. The distance between them no more than a breath. No one in the vehicle spoke. Even the engine seemed too loud now. Daniel realized, without meaning to, that he had stopped framing the shot the way he usually did. He wasn't looking for angles or light or composition. He was simply holding the moment in place, as if moving too quickly might break it. The cub shifted once, inching closer, not enough to disturb, just enough to erase the space that had been left between them. And then it went still. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat down onto the open land. The rest of the world continued without noticing. But inside the small rectangle of Daniel's lens, something had changed, something that didn't belong to the rhythm he knew. He exhaled slowly, barely aware of it. Behind him, someone reached toward the ignition key again. Daniel didn't look back. "Wait," he said quietly, because the cub wasn't leaving, and whatever it had chosen to do, it hadn't finished yet. The heat settled in slowly, pressing down on the land with a weight that made everything move less, breathe slower, exist more quietly. Daniel shifted his stance beside the vehicle, lowering the camera just an inch. Not enough to stop recording, just enough to see without the barrier of glass and focus rings. Around him, the crew had drifted into a loose stillness, each person caught between watching and not wanting to. Out there, nothing changed, and yet everything had. The cub remained beside the other lion, its body angled slightly now, as if adjusting to the rising sun. It didn't nudge, it didn't paw, it didn't attempt the small, desperate actions animals usually made when something was wrong. It simply stayed. "That's not normal," the youngest one said again, more to himself than anyone else. His hands hovered near his chest, unsure whether to fold, to reach, or to do nothing at all. Daniel didn't respond. He had seen cubs panic. He had seen them cry out in thin, frantic sounds that carried farther than they understood. He had seen them bite, push, circle in confusion when something familiar no longer moved. This was none of that. The cub leaned slightly forward, lowering its head again, not in urgency, but in careful attention. It pressed its muzzle close, then lifted it, repeating the motion as though measuring something invisible between breaths. "Is it waiting?" someone asked quietly. The question lingered in the air longer than it should have. Daniel found himself watching the space between the two bodies more than the bodies themselves. The tiny shifts, the almost movements, the way the cub adjusted its position not in response to the other lion, but to the light, the heat, the direction of the wind. It edged closer, not suddenly, gradually, a few inches at a time, until the distance between them disappeared completely. The cub's flank now touched the other's side. A soft contact, barely there, but intentional. The youngest crew member exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath without realizing it. "We should do something." The words came out too fast this time, too loud for the silence that surrounded them. "What exactly?" the driver asked without turning around. "I don't know, anything. We're just standing here." Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, steady. "That's exactly what we're supposed to be doing." The young man turned toward him. "And just watch it. What? Die?" Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the cub, because the cub wasn't acting like something was ending. It wasn't searching for a solution. It wasn't looking for escape. It wasn't even looking toward the ridge anymore, where the rest of the pride had vanished into distance and safety. It had already made its decision. The cub shifted again, turning its body slightly so that its back faced the sun, casting a thin line of shade across the other lion's torso. It held that position, adjusting subtly as the light moved, as if tracking something only it could feel. The gesture was small, practical, but it carried a strange kind of awareness. Daniel felt a tightening in his throat. He had spent years telling stories about instinct, about the brutal clarity of survival, about the absence of sentiment in the wild. That had been the rule, the explanation, the comfort. But this didn't fit, not cleanly, not at all. The cub lowered its head again, resting its chin near the other lion's shoulder. It didn't close its eyes. It remained alert, but not in the way of something guarding or anticipating danger. It was present, completely. The young man stepped forward just one pace, as if testing an invisible boundary. Daniel's hand came up immediately, not forceful, but enough to stop him. "No." The word was quiet, but it held. The young man hesitated, then glanced back at the others. No one moved to support him. No one moved at all. "Why not?" he asked, his voice softer now, edged with something closer to confusion than defiance. Daniel finally looked at him. "Because this isn't about us." The answer didn't resolve anything. It only shifted the weight of the moment somewhere deeper. Out in the grass, the cub lifted its head. For a second, Daniel thought it might finally stand, might break the stillness that had settled like dust over the scene. His fingers tightened slightly around the camera grip, instinctively preparing to follow motion. But the cub didn't leave. It turned its head slowly, scanning the ground beside it. Not the horizon, not the sky. The ground. As if searching for something small, specific, deliberate. Daniel felt his breath catch without warning, because whatever the cub was about to do, it wasn't instinct, and it wasn't finished. A thin breeze moved through the grass, bending the dry stems just enough to reveal patches of bare earth beneath. The cub's gaze followed that movement, not hurried, not distracted, intent. Daniel raised the camera again, but this time more slowly, as if speed itself might disturb whatever fragile line the moment was walking. The cub leaned forward and lowered its mouth toward the ground. For a second, nothing happened. Then, carefully, it closed its jaws around something small, so small that it almost disappeared between its teeth. A brittle strand of grass. It lifted its head with unusual steadiness, holding the dry stem in place as it turned back. No one spoke. The youngest crew member shifted his weight, his boots scraping softly against the dirt, but the sound felt too loud for what was happening. He froze, eyes locked on the movement unfolding 100 yards away. "That doesn't mean anything," he whispered, as if trying to anchor himself to something familiar. "It's just random." But even as he said it, his voice thinned, because nothing about the cub's movement felt random. It stepped closer to the other lion, lowering its head with deliberate care. The grass stem trembled slightly in its mouth, not from wind, but from the fine control it took to place it exactly where it intended. Daniel felt a pressure build behind his ribs, slow and heavy. The cub paused, hovering just above the still body. Then it released. The piece of grass fell lightly, settling across the unmoving chest. Not dropped, placed. A silence followed that felt deeper than anything that had come before. Daniel didn't realize he had lowered the camera again until it was already hanging loose in his hand. He didn't want the distance of the lens, not now, not for this. Behind him someone inhaled sharply, then covered their mouth, as if afraid that even breath might intrude. The cub remained where it was for a moment, head still lowered, watching the place where the grass now rested. There was no immediate reaction, no shift in posture, no sign that it expected anything to change. It simply observed. Then, slowly, it adjusted its body and lowered itself to the ground again, this time closer than before. Close enough that its shoulder pressed firmly against the other lion's side. Close enough that the rise and fall, however faint, would be impossible to miss. Daniel's eyes moved between the two bodies, searching for explanation, for context, for anything that would place the moment back inside the boundaries he understood. There was none. No urgency, no confusion, no attempt to fix. Only a quiet sequence of actions that carried their own internal logic, one that didn't ask to be explained. The youngest crew member shook his head slightly, his eyes wet now, though he didn't seem to notice. "Animals don't do that," he said, but the words came out like a question. Daniel didn't answer, because he wasn't sure anymore what animals did or didn't do. The cub shifted again, settling its weight more fully against the other lion. Its breathing slowed, matching something. Whether real or remembered, Daniel couldn't tell. The sun dipped a fraction lower, softening the harsh lines of the landscape. Light pooled in warmer tones, brushing over the two small forms with a gentleness that felt undeserved and entirely right at the same time. Daniel found himself sitting down without remembering the moment he decided to. The ground was still warm beneath him. He watched as the cub rested its head along the curve of the other lion's neck, not pressing, not forcing, just enough to remain connected. Time stretched. No one reached for the camera now. No one adjusted lenses or checked batteries. They simply stayed, because leaving even for a moment felt like breaking something that could not be repaired. The grass lay unmoving across the still chest. The cub did not touch it again. It had already done what it needed to do. Daniel felt something unfamiliar rise in him. Not shock, not even sadness in the way he recognized it, but a quiet dismantling of the distance he had built over years of watching life unfold through glass and storyboards. This wasn't something he could frame. It wasn't something he could narrate. It simply was. And it wasn't over. Because the cub wasn't watching the horizon. It wasn't waiting for the pride. It wasn't looking for danger. It was listening. As if there were still something left to hear. A long stretch of quiet settled over the clearing, the kind that made even small movements feel like interruptions. The light had begun to change. What had been sharp and white earlier now softened into something warmer, sliding across the land in slow, deliberate strokes. Shadows lengthened, stretching the shapes of grass and stone into thin, wavering lines. Daniel leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the two lions without blinking. The cub's body had stilled almost completely, but not in rest, in attention. Its side rose and fell in a steady rhythm, one that seemed too measured, too intentional to be unconscious. After a while, Daniel realized what it was doing. It was matching something. Not perfectly, not evenly, but closely enough to suggest effort. He shifted his gaze to the other lion. The movement there was faint, so faint that it could be missed if you looked away for even a second. A shallow lift, a pause, then another, weaker still. The space between breaths had begun to stretch. Daniel felt his own breathing slow, unconsciously falling into the same pattern, watching, waiting, counting without meaning to. Beside him, the youngest crew member wiped his face with the back of his hand, quick and rough, as if trying to erase something he didn't want to acknowledge. "It's getting worse," he murmured. No one responded, because there was nothing to argue with. Out in the grass, the cub adjusted slightly, pressing closer, not with urgency, but with a careful, controlled shift that kept its body aligned with the others. Its head moved just enough to rest more firmly along the curve of the neck, as if anchoring itself there. The thin strand of grass remained where it had been placed, unmoved by wind or motion. Time slipped forward in uneven pieces. A bird called once in the distance, then fell silent. The heat began to lift from the ground, replaced by a cooling edge that crept into the air without warning. The world beyond the small clearing resumed its rhythm, subtle, indifferent, but inside that space, everything slowed to something closer to stillness. Daniel realized he had stopped thinking about filming entirely. There was no narrative left to construct, no arc to anticipate. Only a presence that demanded nothing and offered nothing but itself. The cub's breathing changed. Not dramatically, not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough. The rhythm softened, slowed, as if easing into something gentler. Its chest rose and fell in longer intervals now, each breath less about urgency and more about alignment. Daniel swallowed, the motion dry and quiet. He shifted his focus again to the other lion. For a moment there was nothing. Then, barely a shallow movement, a breath that seemed to hesitate before it came. Daniel leaned in without realizing it, his body mirroring the tension of waiting. The cub did not move. It remained exactly where it was, its side pressed close, its head resting, its body offering nothing but presence. Another breath. Weaker, longer pause. The youngest crew member turned his head away this time, unable to keep watching the space between those moments. The driver stared straight ahead, jaw set, hands still gripping the wheel, though the engine had long since been turned off. Daniel didn't look away. He couldn't, because something in him understood that this was the point where people usually left, where cameras cut, where stories moved on to something else. But nothing here was moving on. The light dimmed further, slipping toward evening. The cub's body remained steady, but there was a subtle shift in the way it held itself, less tension, more weight, as if it had stopped expecting something to change. Daniel's chest tightened. The next breath didn't come. He didn't know how long he waited. A second. 2. Maybe more. Time lost its edges. Then, a faint rise, so slight it could have been imagined. The cub's ear flicked once, a small, almost imperceptible reaction. It didn't lift its head. It didn't adjust. It stayed. as if it understood that even that fragile movement needed space. Another pause followed, longer this time. The world around them continued without notice. The wind brushed the grass again. A distant shape moved along the ridge far beyond, but none of it reached the clearing, because inside that small, quiet space, everything had narrowed to a single, fragile thread. The cub pressed closer, not forcefully, just enough to remain connected. And then it stopped adjusting altogether. No more small corrections, no more subtle shifts, only stillness. Daniel felt something break loose inside him. Not loud, not sharp, but deep, like a structure giving way under its own weight. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible. Beside him, the youngest crew member covered his face completely now. No one spoke, because there was nothing left that words could hold. The cub remained where it was, its body curved protectively, its presence unbroken. And as the last light thinned into dusk, it didn't move away. Not even when the world around them began to darken, not even when the moment they had been waiting for had already passed. It stayed, as if leaving now would mean something far greater than simply walking away. Night didn't fall all at once. It gathered, layer by layer, until the color drained from the land and left only outlines. Daniel became aware of the temperature before anything else. The heat that had pressed down all day was gone, replaced by a quiet cold rising from the ground. It moved through the grass, through his boots, into his bones. Still, he didn't stand. No one did. Out in the dimming light, the small shape of the cub remained exactly where it had been, its body curved along the others, unmoving except for the slow, steady rise of its own breath. It hadn't shifted, not when the light faded, not when the air cooled, not even when the world around it had begun to change. "Daniel," the driver said softly, his voice almost apologetic, "we should go." The words lingered between them, fragile, like something that could break if spoken again. Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the two forms now blending into shadow, the edges softening, details disappearing. Soon they would be lost entirely to the night, and still the cub did not leave. It didn't pace. It didn't hesitate. It stayed with the same quiet certainty it had shown all afternoon. The youngest crew member lowered his hands from his face, his eyes red, unfocused. "How long is it going to—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Daniel shook his head once. There was no timeline for this, no script, only the continuation of a choice that had already been made. He pushed himself up slowly, joints stiff, the motion feeling heavier than it should have. For a moment he considered lifting the camera again, capturing one last frame before darkness swallowed the scene completely. But he didn't. He let it hang at his side. Some things didn't belong inside a frame. He took a step back toward the vehicle, then stopped again, turning for one final look. The cub was still there, a single small presence against the wide, indifferent land. Daniel felt something shift inside him, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, a recognition that what he had spent years searching for in dramatic chases and sharp conflicts had been here all along, hidden in moments that didn't demand attention. Moments like this. He climbed into the vehicle without another word. The engine turned over, low and reluctant, breaking the silence that had held them for hours. The headlights remained off. No one wanted to push light into that space, to claim it, to disturb what had been left behind. As the vehicle rolled forward, slowly, carefully, Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the spot where the two lions lay, until he could no longer see them, until the darkness took them completely. Weeks later, the footage sat untouched on his editing screen. Hours of material, days of waiting. Most of it empty in the way the savanna often was, wide, patient, uneventful to anyone who didn't know where to look. He scrolled past it all. Hunts, movements, distant herds, none of it held. He stopped when he found the moment again, the cub walking back, the still form ahead, the slow, deliberate lowering of its body into the grass. Daniel didn't cut it. He didn't shorten it. He didn't add music. He let the silence remain. When the scene reached the part where the cub placed the thin strand of grass, he paused the footage. His hand hovered over the keyboard. For years he had named his work with precision, titles that promised tension, conflict, resolution. Stories that told the audience what they were about to feel before they even pressed play. This time, nothing fit. Not accurately. Not honestly. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly in his eyes. There was no twist here. No reveal, no victory, only a single unbroken choice. He reached forward and typed. 2 words. He stayed. Daniel stared at the title for a long moment, as if expecting it to change into something more elaborate, more acceptable, more useful. It didn't, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to adjust it. He pressed save. Outside, somewhere far beyond the walls of the editing room, the world continued as it always did, loud, fast, full of things demanding attention. But inside that quiet frame of memory, held in pixels and silence, a small lion cub remained exactly where it had chosen to be. Not because it didn't understand what had happened, but because it did. Sometimes love isn't about saving someone. It's about staying when leaving would be easier. What that cub did reminds us that presence can matter more than power. If this moment meant something to you, there are more stories waiting, quiet, honest ones that stay with you long after they end.
If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts and follow Lion's Quiet Stories for more.